Okay? Now, this woman lived 96 years. Which means you have to add 50 more years to that date. Go ahead and do it real quick. 50 more years to that date, and then back it up 4 years. Subtract 4 from that. That'll get you to your 96. Let me play this game with you. It's another way to play this game. On the paper in front of you right now, draw a line really quickly like a number line that goes across the page. Go ahead and do it. Draw a line that's like a number line. Go ahead. This is a very interesting game. I've had juniors that say when they play this game with me, they go, wow, I've never really thought of it that way. Draw a line across the number line. At the very beginning on the left, go ahead and write that date down of your birth. Go ahead and do this. Write the date down of your birth. Question. Where will you put 50? On that line. Go ahead, write down the 50. When you turn 50, where will you put that 50? Will you put that 50 at the center of the line? Or somewhere out beyond the center of the line? Draw a mark on the line where you think you would like to live to. How old do you want to be when you crank? How old do you want to be when you crank? Do you want to crank at 30? Do you want to crank at 50? Do you want to crank at 70? Whoa, 70 years. Where would you put the mark on the line at 70 years? What year will that be for you if you die at 70? How old do you want to be when you go? 96, a long time. You see a lot of life. Who is the oldest person you know? 3B. I'll ask another question. Who is the oldest person that you've ever met? I once was privileged to have a conversation with a woman of 94. That was a remarkable conversation. 6 years from 100 years old. And I asked her questions like, what was it like when you were my age? And she said, it's so strange. She said, when I think about it, inside, I still feel like I'm an 18-year-old girl. I can remember everything about that time. But then I look in the mirror and I know, I'm not. I'm getting older. Final question for the Lucinda Matlock. What do you want written on your tombstone? If you were to die tonight, and people stood around an open hole in the floor and buried you, and then there was some kind of stone erected over your grave to talk about you, obviously something would be said about the fact that you died young. You never even made it to the age of 20. What would you like for the words on that stone to say? Interestingly, that question leads us to our next poem, Richard Bone, on page 647. We're studying these poems in companionship to some degree. Let's take a look now at the Richard Bone poem on 647. You'll want to go to a new annotation now, to a second annotation. And we're going to look at this one. Now, I'm going to set you up here at level 1 by saying a couple of things. First of all, you want to make sure that you know that Richard Bone is one of the people in this community who made those tombstones. Fascinating job, right? Your job is to make the words, the epitaphs that go on the tombstone. Your job is to carve them into the stone with your hammer and your chisel. You actually do it and you put it in the stone. So people die, people crank, and then they come to you, people who are their friends, come to you and say, this is what we need to have written on the tombstone. Okay? This is that guy, Richard Bone. It's interesting, of course, that masters would call him Richard Bone. Jot down really quickly the irony of that one at 2B. What's ironic about the guy who spent his life carving the epitaphs of people in this community on the stones was called Richard Bone. Right? Alright, let's take a look at what he has to say about his life. Another, again, dramatic monologue. Let's read along.
Richard Bone by Edgar Lee Masters. When I first came to Spoon River, I did not know whether what they told me was true or false. They would bring me the epitaph and stand around the shop while I worked and say, "He was so kind. He was wonderful. She was the sweetest woman. He was a consistent Christian." And I chiseled for them whatever they wished, all in ignorance of its truth. But later, as I lived among the people here, I knew how near to the life were the epitaphs that were ordered for them as they died. But still, I chiseled whatever they paid me to chisel and made myself party to the false chronicles of the stones. Even as the historian does, who writes without knowing the truth, or because he is influenced to hide it.
Now this is an interesting little poem that again is kind of divided into two parts. Let's write it down at level 1. Part 1, he says, I came to this town and I got a job. My job was to chisel the words that go on people's tombstones. That was my job. And sometimes the friends of the dead person stood right there and said, this is what I want you to write about that person on the stone. And he says, when I first came to the town, I really didn't know very many people. And so it's like, I didn't know the truth of what they were saying, whether it was like true or not. People, of course, are often going to put things on a tombstone that maybe are not true, but they're, nice about the person or whatever. But he says in the second part, and this is the second part of the poem, he says, but I still chiseled, he said, whatever they paid me to chisel. And I made myself party to the false chronicles. That is to say, I wrote the stuff even if I knew it wasn't true. Think about it. Once you've lived in a town and you know people, and then they crank, and their family comes to you and says, we want you to chisel, they were a really nice person, and you go, yeah, but they weren't a really nice person. Nobody in this town even liked that person. No, that's what we want you to write about it. And you're going to put it on their tombstone, and this is going to stay there for as long as people go to the cemetery and look at it. Do it. And he says about that, I did it. In the same way that a historian kind of makes up history, I did it. End of poem. It's a strange little poem. It says, though, more about maybe the town than it does about the dead. Let's work at 2A for a moment and make a couple of quick observations about possible themes, messages here. Notice that this poem suggests that you're remembered after the fact by the people who are left living. And they make up the stories about you. And many of those stories end up on a tombstone. This seems to suggest, at 2A also, that there's often more than one of you. I said this to juniors, and they go, wow, I've never thought about that. There's more than one of you. There's the you that's living right now, and then there's the you that will be remembered after you're gone. Think about that. There's the you that's living right now, and then there's the you that will be remembered after you're gone. There's the person you love living right now, and then there will be the person you love after he or she is gone that you will remember, right? You'll kind of remember things about them. A possible third message here is that when people die, it probably does make sense to try to remember the good about them and not the bad. And to share that on the tombstone. Right? Try and hold on to the good about someone instead of the bad. Let's jump really quickly to 2B. What do we want to say about this poem? Well, again, a dramatic monologue. A person speaking. Again, Richard Bone now is dead. But he's saying about his life that he lived in Spoon River, that his job was to kind of record information about these people on their stones, on their tombstones. He also is going to indict himself to some degree and say, you know what, I kind of participated in falsehood, but, it is what it is. People want to remember the good and not the bad. Somehow hold on to the good and not the bad. Let's jump to now 3A really quickly, and possible texts you can relate to this one. I want to take you now to your favorite movie or TV show where a person has last words that he or she speaks right before he or she dies. Last words. So for example, throughout the entire movie you've been watching this person do all these things, and then all of a sudden, I don't know, gunshot or whatever, and the individual is going to die. But before the individual dies, the individual speaks some words. Do you have a film in mind like that that you like? Where the camera comes up close on the face, and the lips move, and everybody gets quiet and leans in, and then says something. In literature, we have lots of examples of this. Maybe one of the most famous is probably Joseph Conrad's classic Heart of Darkness. That's the title, Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe goes up the river to find Kurtz, and at the very end, he leans in to hear Kurtz say about his life only those famous two words, the horror, the horror. And then he dies, leaving Marlowe to wonder exactly what it is about Kurtz's life that made him say the horror, the horror. Was he talking about his own life or talking about the world that he had to live in? What is for you your favorite story about the last words? When you're a senior, you'll study, for example, Beowulf, the great Anglo-Saxon hero, who will, at the final moment, right before he dies, he will have to speak famous words. Think about the famous movies. I mean, you're always thinking, for example, about when you talk about famous movies like Star Wars, right? Where you have a famous hero in the film who then is going to die, and in last seconds will speak words. Whoa, that's interesting, the way that last words spoken by a famous hero is sometimes going to be these really famous words whereby can be remembered. What is for you, your favorite film where there is a funeral? Do you have one of those? Where there is a tombstone? Do you have one of those? Tombstones are very famous. For example, we might make a point that one of the most famous tombstone epitaphs is written by John Keats. Let's write it down. K-E-A-T-S. John Keats, who will have written on his own tombstone the phrase, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." Here lies one whose name was writ in water. We'll talk about this when you're a senior. Keats saying, I know I'm going to be totally forgotten, and my life will be totally forgotten. Let's jump to 3B really quickly. What for you are the things you hope people will remember about your life? Can you jot down 3 things you want to be remembered for really quickly? Just 3. What are 3 things right now that you could write down at 3B that you would say, I want to be remembered for these 3 things? When I die, I want at least people to say this about me. What is that? Is it about something you are or something you've done? Something you've accomplished or the kind of person that you are? Right? Notice in the poem, Richard Bone, the things that were said about people. He was so kind. He was wonderful. She was the sweetest woman. He was a consistent Christian. Notice these are interesting observations. They don't seem to be so much about things that they actually did, but more things that they were, the kind of person that they were. What do you want to have said about you in the end? What for you will be the way that you will be remembered? Well, there you go. An introduction to Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River Anthology. Thank you.